The last light of a September evening lay gold across the limestone hillside, catching the dust that rose from wagon wheels on the narrow track below. She stood in the doorway of a home no one else in the valley would have called a home at all. A wide mouth of stone, dressed with a sturdy plank door, its hinges oiled and true, its frame fitted so carefully into the rock that a stranger passing on the road might never guess a cave lay behind the timber at all. Hens moved in easy circles around her skirts, clucking low and contented, pecking at scattered grain. Beyond them, a garden climbed in orderly rows toward the blackberry thicket that had once hidden this place from the world. Beans heavy on their poles, squash vines sprawling fat and green, the last of the summer corn standing tall enough to whisper in the evening wind. The air smelled of turned earth and cool spring water, and the particular sweetness of a life that had, against every reasonable expectation, taken root. 2 wagons were coming up the track, their wheels catching the last sun. She recognized the mare pulling the near one, the baker's own horse, plodding and patient, and behind it a lighter buggy she knew belonged to the boarding-house keeper's wife, who had not so long ago looked past her in the street as though she were made of nothing but dust and bad luck. Her husband came around the side of the chicken yard, wiping his hands on a rag, and stood beside her without a word, the two of them watching the wagons climb. He smelled of hay and wood smoke and the particular mineral coolness of the cave's back chamber, where the spring still ran clear and endless, no matter how dry the summer grew. A year. It hardly seemed possible, standing here with the hens fussing and the baskets already stacked and waiting by the door, that a year ago she had stood in the dust of Juniper Crossing's one crooked street, with nothing to her name but a trunk, a husband, and a future that no one in that town had given them so much as a season to survive. She remembered the innkeeper's flat refusal, the way the storekeeper's wife had looked at her boots, worn thin from the wagon road, and made no effort to hide her doubt. She remembered thinking, that first terrible evening, that they might sleep beneath the wagon itself and call it shelter. She had not imagined then that salvation would come wearing feathers, hidden behind a wall of thorns on a hillside nobody wanted. The lead wagon drew up at the fence, and the baker's boy hopped down, calling a cheerful greeting across the yard. The same boy who, a year before, would have crossed the street rather than walk near them. She smiled and lifted her hand in answer, and beside her Samuel let out a breath that was almost a laugh, low and disbelieving, as if he too were still catching up to the plain fact of what they had made. But the beginning of it, the true beginning, had been far less golden than this. It had been the last week of September when the wagon first rattled into Juniper Crossing, the wheels caked with a summer's worth of red dust, the mule half lame from the final grade down out of the hills. She had been 25 then, though the road had aged her more than any birthday could, and he had been 27, his jaw set in that particular way he had when he was frightened and did not want her to see it. They had come with a letter in his coat pocket, a promise, in another man's careful hand, that the small cabin at the edge of the Hollis claim would be theirs to rent come autumn, $40 a year, and welcome. It was not much of a cabin. Neither of them had ever seen it, only heard it described in a letter passed hand to hand from a cousin of a cousin back in the Willamette Valley. But it was a roof, and a roof had seemed, on the long weeks of the road, like the finest thing in the world. The man who met them at the livery only shook his head slow and apologetic, as if the news pained him personally, though it plainly did not. The Petersons had come through in July, he said, with 4 children and a milk cow and cash money in hand, and Hollis was not the sort of man to wait on a letter when there was silver on the table. The cabin was theirs now. He was sorry. He did not look sorry. She remembered standing very still in the livery's shadow, the mule blowing softly behind her, and feeling the whole shape of their future dissolve like sugar in rain. There had been no other rooms to be had. The boarding-house keeper's wife had looked them over, her patched hem, his sun-cracked hands, and said, not unkindly but not gently either, that she kept a respectable house and could not extend credit to strangers. The storekeeper had offered them flour on account, provided they had somewhere to store it, which of course they did not. Word traveled fast in a town of that size, and by the second day it seemed every soul in Juniper Crossing had already decided what would become of them. She had overheard two women outside the church, unaware she was near enough to hear, remarking that the young couple would not see Christmas, that the mountains took newcomers who came with empty pockets and no kin to help them, and it was a shame, truly, but there it was. She had not told Samuel what she'd heard. She hadn't needed to. He'd heard some version of it himself, from the blacksmith, from the man at the feed store, from the very silence of doors that did not open to them. That third night, with the wagon drawn up beneath a stand of lodgepole pine and no shelter but canvas between them and the coming frost, Samuel had taken her hand in the dark and said only that they would find something. She had believed him, because she had no other choice left worth keeping. It was the next morning, following a doe track up through blackberry thicket gone wild and thorned as a fortress wall, that they first heard the sound, faint, unmistakable, absurd, of hens clucking from somewhere inside the hillside itself. They stood very still, the way a person stands when uncertain whether the ear or the mind has invented something out of pure wanting. The sound came again, a low, contented clucking, muffled by distance and stone, and Samuel's grip on her hand tightened as though she might vanish if he let go. But the thicket before them was no ordinary hedge. Blackberry canes as thick as a man's wrist rose in tangled walls, thorned and ancient, woven so densely that even the doe track vanished beneath them within a few yards. They pressed forward until the canes drew blood at wrist and cheek, and at last had to admit defeat, retreating with torn sleeves and no clearer notion of where the sound had come from than when they'd first heard it. That was the beginning of what became, in later memory, the longest week of that whole difficult summer. Each morning they rose from the wagon stiff with cold, for the nights had already begun turning sharp, in a way that spoke of the season slipping past them faster than they could afford. They walked the hills above the settlement from first light until the sun stood high and merciless, circling wider each day, searching for some seam in the brush, some old trail a homesteader might have cut before abandoning the land. They found the collapsed frame of a line shack, roofless and full of nettles. They found a spring nearly dry and a claim marker half rotted into the ground, bearing a name no one in Juniper Crossing seemed to remember. They did not find shelter. By the fourth day, Lydia's boots had worn through at the heel, and Samuel had taken to walking with a stick he'd cut for testing the ground before brush that might hide a badger's den or a drop unseen. They spoke less as the week wore on, not from anger, but from the particular silence of two people conserving what strength remained to them. In the evenings, sharing what little bread and dried meat was left from the stores they'd brought west, she watched the light shorten visibly against the ridgeline, gold going to gray an hour earlier than it had when they'd first arrived, and understood with a plain, unfrightened clarity that time was becoming their true adversary, more than any cold shoulder in town. Still, the sound of the hens stayed with her, returning at odd moments like a thread she could not put down. On the sixth day, Weary and half convinced, they had imagined the whole thing. They climbed once more toward the blackberry wall, this time following its edge, rather than trying to force a way through the middle of it. Samuel moved slower now, testing each patch of bramble with his stick before committing his weight to the ground beneath it, and she followed close behind, one hand resting on his shoulder for balance where the slope steepened. The blackberry wall ran on longer than either had guessed from a distance, thick as a granary wall in places, thin and scraggly in others where the soil beneath must have been poorer. It was in one of these thin places, where the canes had grown leggy and pale from want of sun, that Samuel stopped so suddenly she nearly walked into him. "There," he said, and pointed with the stick rather than his hand, as though afraid a gesture too large might make the thing vanish. Through a gap no wider than a doorway, pale stone showed behind the leaves. Not a boulder, not an outcrop, but a face of rock curving inward, disappearing into shadow. They worked at the canes together, Samuel bending them back while Lydia held them clear, both mindful of thorns, and slowly the gap widened into an opening a person might walk through without stooping. Cool air breathed out from it, startling after the dry heat of the hillside, carrying a mineral smell of wet stone and something else beneath it, straw, and the faint dusty scent of feathers. Samuel struck a match with hands that were not quite steady and lit the stub of lantern wick he had saved for just such a need, cupping the flame until it caught and held. He raised it before them, and the light spread across a chamber wider than their wagon bed had been long, its ceiling arching up into darkness the small flame could not reach. Limestone walls, pale as old bone, curved smooth in places and rough in others where water must once have run. Neither spoke as they stepped inside. The ground was dry underfoot, packed earth rather than mud, and dry leaves had drifted in some past autumn to gather in the corners. Along one wall stood the source of the scent that had drawn them across 3 ridges, a row of rough wooden boxes, weathered gray, clearly built by hands long gone from this place, and scattered near them a scatter of pale feathers, old straw, the unmistakable signs of birds having lived and nested there. Lydia pressed her hand flat against the cool stone wall as if to prove to herself it was real, and Samuel turned slowly with the lantern raised, taking the measure of the space the way he might once have measured a room back east. Width, height, the soundness of what surrounded them. Outside, the last of the daylight was going gray along the ridge, but here, sheltered from wind and weather both, something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 6 days began, cautiously, to loosen. Whatever waited in the deeper dark beyond the lantern's reach, this much was certain: they had found walls that would not turn them away. A sound came then, small and dry, like paper crumpling somewhere in the dark, and both of them went still. He lowered the lantern an inch, as though that might help him hear better, and the sound came again, closer this time, a soft scratching followed by a low, throaty murmur that was unmistakably a hen settling herself on a roost. Neither of them moved for a long moment, and then, without a word between them, they stepped further into the chamber, past the nesting boxes, toward a shallow recess where the stone folded back on itself and the shadows thickened. There, huddled together in a loose knot of gray and rust-colored feathers, sat perhaps a dozen hens, their eyes catching the lantern light like small dull coins, and beside them, tucked half beneath a wing, the pale fluff of chicks not yet a season old. She let out a breath she had not known she was holding, and it came out half laugh, half something closer to weeping. He crouched slowly, the way a man might approach a spooked horse, and murmured something low and wordless, and the nearest hen only tilted her head at him, unbothered, as though she had been waiting all this time for someone to come and remember she was there. "They've been feeding themselves," he said finally, his voice hushed as though the cave itself might startle. "Insects, seed off the hillside, whatever falls through the brush." He looked to the walls, to the dry floor, to the old boxes built with careful, patient hands. Somebody kept a flock here once, built for them. Left them. He did not finish the thought, and she did not ask him to. She knelt beside him, watching a young chick pick its way over its mother's folded leg, and found she could not stop looking at it, this small living proof that something had endured here in the dark, and the damp, and the years of silence, waiting without knowing what it waited for. She thought of the 6 nights behind them, the doors shut in their faces, the men in the boarding house who had laughed at the sight of their wagon, and she thought that surely there was some strange mercy in it, that of all the hollows and hills in this valley, their feet had carried them to this one. "We could tend them," she said, and it was not quite a question. He looked at her over the lantern light, and something in his face eased, the tight line of his jaw softening for the first time in days. "We could," he said, "if we're staying." Outside, the wind had risen, rattling the blackberry canes across the cave mouth, and somewhere beyond that green curtain, the valley was settling into full dark. But here, in this borrowed shelter, with its forgotten flock, neither of them was thinking any longer of leaving. Morning came gray and mild, the kind of early autumn light that seemed to hang suspended over the valley, neither warm nor cold, as if the season itself were deciding what to become. He walked the 2 miles into Juniper Crossing before the dew had lifted, and came back leading the borrowed mule with a wagon bed piled high with the mill's discarded lumber, warped boards, offcuts too short for building proper houses, but sound enough for a floor if a man had patience and a plane. The mill owner had asked no questions beyond whether he intended to pay, and had seemed almost amused when he said he would work off the debt hauling slag on Saturdays. She watched him unload it piece by piece at the cave mouth, sorting the good from the split, and she thought this was not so different from courting, the same slow accounting of what might be salvaged and what could not. They gathered fieldstone from the creek bed those first weeks, carrying it up in a sling made from an old horse blanket, 2 or 3 stones at a time so as not to strain her back, though she insisted on carrying her share regardless of what he said about it. The stones went to level the cave floor, where it dipped and buckled near the entrance, packed tight with clay dug from the bank, tamped down with the flat of a shovel until it held firm underfoot. Only then did the planking go down, board by board, each one measured against its neighbor and shaved where it did not fit, for nothing in a salvage pile ever fit exactly as a man wished. In the evenings, by lantern and the last gray light through the blackberry canes, he built a frame along the cave's front wall, using saplings cut from the hillside and nails straightened from a barrel the blacksmith had been glad to be rid of. She sewed sacking into curtains to keep the draft from the sleeping corner, and fashioned shelves from the shortest boards, fitting them into notches he cut at careful intervals, so that soon there was a place for the flour tin, a place for the lantern oil, a place for the small clock that had somehow survived the wagon's jolting all the way from Ohio. It was slow work, and some nights her hands ached too much to sew another stitch, and some nights he came in from the woods with his knuckles split from handling stone, but neither of them spoke of turning back. There was a rhythm settling over them now, the rhythm of 2 people building toward something rather than fleeing from it, and each plank set level, each shelf hung true, felt like an answer to every closed door behind them. By the time the maples along the creek had gone gold and beginning to drop, the front chamber no longer looked like a cave at all, but a small room waiting only for a door. The door came last, and it came dear. He had traded 3 days' labor at the sawmill for the planks alone, splitting his hours between hauling stone from the hillside and swinging a broadaxe alongside men half again his size, men who had laughed at him not so many weeks before, but who now nodded when he lifted his end of a log without complaint. He came home each evening with his shoulders aching and his palms raw, and each evening she had something warm waiting on the little stove they had carried in pieces from the mercantile, a stove no bigger than a washtub, its firebox scarcely wide enough for 2 split logs, but it drew well, and its small iron door glowed like a lantern when the damper was set right. The first night they lit it, the front chamber filled with a heat that seemed to press back the very stone, and she had stood with her hands spread toward it, laughing at how strange it was to feel warm inside a mountain. The bed frame he built from cedar, choosing the wood for its scent as much as its strength, and she stuffed the mattress ticking with dried grass and corn husks until it held its shape beneath her weight. They set it against the back wall where the rock rose smooth and dry, away from any draft that might slip past the door once it was hung, and she sewed a quilt from scraps of her mother's old dresses, piecing together blues and grays until the bed looked less like a makeshift thing and more like the heart of a home. The door itself he built plank by plank on the last cool days before the frost came, fitting it into a frame he had shimmed and leveled against the uneven mouth of the cave, working by lamplight some evenings when the daylight ran out before the work did. He hung it on leather hinges bought with the last of the egg money, and when he swung it shut for the first time, the sound it made, a solid, settling thud, wood meeting wood, struck them both silent for a moment, as though something had been decided. She stood beside him in the dark that followed, the stove ticking softly as it cooled, the hens murmuring somewhere out in their yard, and she reached for his hand without needing to look for it. Outside, the wind that had been rising all week found the hillside and rattled through the bare blackberry canes, but inside the cave it could not reach them. The cold that had followed them across 2 territories, that had waited outside every rented room denied them, now stood outside a door that was theirs. She did not say aloud what she was thinking, that they had built, with borrowed nails and traded labor and her own 2 hands, the first true walls either of them had ever called home. But he must have felt it too, for he did not let go of her hand for a long while, and neither of them moved to light the lamp again that night. Morning came gray and slow, the kind of light that seemed reluctant to commit to day at all, and she woke to find he had already gone out to the hens. She followed him into the cold antechamber where the flock had taken to roosting on an old crate, their feathers puffed against the chill, and together they surveyed what remained of the nesting boxes the previous homesteader had left behind. Half of them had rotted through, the wood soft and crumbling under a careless thumb, and the wire mesh that had once kept the birds contained hung in rusted tatters from splintered frames. They worked through that first week the way they had come to work through everything, without complaint, without hurry, trading the labor back and forth as their strength allowed. He pried loose the ruined boards while she sorted through them for anything salvageable, and what could not be saved was fed carefully into the little stove, so that even their failures kept them warm. She stitched together scraps of wire mesh scavenged from an old fence line near the road, and he cut fresh boxes from the same lumber that had built their door, measuring each one against the hens themselves, to be sure they would sit content and undisturbed. The chicken yard took longer. He staked out a half circle against the cave's outer wall, driving posts into ground still soft enough to yield before the frost set in fully, and she wove branches and old fencing between them until the enclosure stood solid against fox and weather alike. They worked side by side in the thin winter light, breath clouding between them, and there was a rhythm to it that neither had known before. Not the desperate scrambling of the summer's arrival, but something steadier, something that felt almost like peace. The hens repaid the effort slowly at first, then with growing confidence, clucking and scratching in their new yard, as though they too sensed the season turning toward safety. Each morning brought its small ceremony. She would carry out the scraps and grain while he checked the boxes, and they would stand together counting eggs still warm from the nest, saying little, needing to say little. In the evenings they sat by the stove mending tools or shelling the last of the dried beans, and she found herself grateful in a way she had not expected to be grateful for cold mornings and calloused hands and a flock of birds that had, by some strange grace, chosen to be found by them. It was not an easy winter. The wind still found its way through gaps in the stone, and there were nights the fire burned low before dawn. But there was purpose now in every chore, and purpose, she was learning, could warm a person nearly as well as any hearth, especially when there was someone beside her to share the weight of it. Spring came the way it always did in that country, not gently, but in a rush, as if the mountain itself had grown impatient with winter's grip. The snow retreated from the blackberry thicket in patches, then all at once, and the spring in the back chamber swelled with meltwater until it ran louder than she had ever heard it. The hens seemed to feel the change before either of them did. One morning she went out to the nesting boxes and found not the usual 4 or 5 eggs, but 11, still faintly warm, crowded together as though the birds themselves had conspired to surprise her. By the following week there were more than 20 a day, then more still, until the shelves inside the cave held baskets stacked upon baskets, far beyond what 2 people could eat, no matter how many ways she found to prepare them. He suggested it first, standing in the doorway with a basket balanced on his hip, half laughing at the absurdity of their abundance. Perhaps, he said, someone in town might want what they could not use. She was not so certain. The memory of Juniper Crossing's cold welcome had not entirely faded. The shut doors, the sideways looks, the quiet certainty of the townsfolk that they would not last the season. But hunger for coin outweighed pride, and one gray morning they walked the trail together, baskets covered with cloth, eggs nestled carefully in straw so none would crack against the ruts in the road. They went first to the boarding house, where the proprietress eyed the eggs with open suspicion before cracking one into a pan and watching the yolk spread thick and orange across the iron. She said nothing for a long moment, then asked, quite plainly, how many dozen they could bring by week's end. From there they carried what remained to the general store, where the keeper weighed the eggs against his own stock and admitted, grudgingly, that theirs were larger. The bakery came last, and it was there that something in the town's manner began, almost imperceptibly, to shift, the baker himself coming out from behind his counter to inspect the basket, turning an egg over in his floured hands as though it were a small marvel. Walking home with empty baskets and a few coins pressed carefully into a handkerchief, neither of them spoke for a long while. The road climbed gently through the pines, the cave waiting ahead like a secret they alone still kept, and she found herself smiling at nothing in particular, at the weight of coin in cloth, at the sound of hens still faintly audible through the trees, at the quiet, astonishing fact that what had begun as desperation was beginning, slowly, to look like a living. By the second week, the baker had stopped waiting for them to come to town. He sent his boy up the pine road instead, a thin, freckled child who arrived breathless at the blackberry thicket, asking, in a rush, whether there were eggs to spare before the Sunday baking. She would send him back with all he could carry, and still it was not enough. The baker began pressing coins into Samuel's palm before the basket was even counted, saying only that he'd trust the number, that he had never yet been cheated by a Warren egg. Word travels strangely in a small valley, not loudly, but steadily, the way water finds its way downhill through the smallest channels. A stagecoach driver who stopped to water his team near the crossing heard talk in the boarding house of eggs so fresh the yolks stood up like little suns, and the next week he came himself, hat in hand, asking if he might buy a dozen to carry east with him. Soon it became a habit among the drivers to stop at the fork in the road rather than the settlement proper, and Lydia took to leaving a small table there in the mornings, covered with a clean cloth, baskets arranged neatly, a tin box for coin that she trusted no one to disturb. Samuel marveled at it, this quiet current of commerce that had begun with nothing but a few frightened hens in a cave. He took to rising earlier, checking the nesting boxes by lantern light before dawn, counting the eggs with the same careful reverence a man might count seed corn before spring planting. Lydia kept a small ledger on a scrap of paper, tallying dozens sold against dozens gathered, and some evenings she would read the numbers aloud to him by the stove, her voice half laughing at how strange it felt to speak of profit when a year before they had not owned a roof. They did not grow careless with the money. It went first into a tin box buried beneath a flat stone near the spring, then slowly into small necessities, a second lantern, a bolt of muslin, nails for mending the coop. But for the first time since they had crossed into the valley, the fear that had followed them like a second shadow began to loosen its hold. They no longer counted the days until winter with dread, but with something closer to purpose, as though the season ahead might be met not as an enemy, but as a task to be prepared for, together. Still, Lydia noticed, watching the hens scratch contentedly in their yard, that demand alone would not carry them through the dry months ahead. And it was the spring, quiet and constant behind them in the dark, that occupied her thoughts as autumn approached. The chicken yard had grown crowded through the summer, planks and wire stretched thin against the press of more birds than either of them had expected to keep, and so on a cool morning in early September, Samuel took up the mattock and began widening the enclosure back toward the rear wall of the cave, where the limestone narrowed into shadow. He worked patiently, prying loose stone that had settled there for who could say how many years, and Lydia carried the rubble out in a bucket, pausing now and again to watch the hens investigate each newly opened patch of ground with their quick, curious steps. It was near midday when Samuel's mattock struck through a thin shelf of rock and opened onto a narrow chamber beyond, cool air breathing out of the gap like a held breath finally released. He knelt and reached his arm through, and when he drew it back, his sleeve was damp to the elbow. Lydia came at once, and together they widened the opening enough to see the trickle of water threading down the limestone wall and pooling in a shallow basin, worn smooth by years of quiet flowing. They stood there a long moment, saying little, letting the sound of it, soft, steady, endless, settle into them the way good news settles slowly into people who have learned not to trust good fortune too quickly. But this was no illusion. The water was cold and clean, and it did not stop. In the days that followed, they fashioned a channel from split cedar troughs, angling the flow out past the chicken yard toward the cave's mouth, where morning sun reached the ground in a long golden strip. Lydia turned the soil there with the spade, working in ash and old straw until the earth darkened and crumbled soft beneath her hands. She planted what seeds they had saved and traded for, turnips, beans, a few hills of squash, and watched the trough water disappear into the rows each evening, murmuring its way down through roots that had, until now, only ever known dry Oregon summers. Samuel built a small stone basin near the garden's edge to catch the overflow, so nothing was wasted, and lined the path with flat rocks to keep the mud from swallowing their boots. In the evenings they sat together at the cave's threshold, listening to hens settle and water run, and it seemed to Lydia that the whole hillside had quietly conspired to give them what they needed, so long as they were willing to work for it. She did not yet know how far that garden would carry them through the coming dry months, but for the first time she believed it might be far enough. The garden had done more than carry them through. By the time autumn came again, painting the hillside in rust and gold, the rows Lydia had turned with ash and old straw stood heavy with squash and dried bean pods, and the turnips pulled up fat and sweet from the cool earth. The spring never faltered, murmuring its way through the stone basin and out into the furrows even in the driest weeks of August. And more than once she had thought of that first frightened season, when they had nothing but a borrowed spade and a handful of traded seed, and marveled at how far a little water and patience could stretch. The hens, too, had multiplied beyond counting. What had begun as a forgotten flock in a dim limestone chamber was now dozens of birds scratching contentedly in the yard Samuel had fenced with split rail and chicken wire, their eggs filling basket after basket each morning. The baker's order alone kept them busy 3 days a week, and the general store had taken to setting aside a standing crate just for their delivery. Even the stagecoach drivers had learned to stop at the fork in the road, asking after eggs before they asked after anything else. It was a warm evening near the equinox when the wagon came up the lane, the same neighbor woman who, a year before, had looked at them with pity and said they'd not last the winter. Now she climbed down smiling, a basket of her own preserves to trade, and stood admiring the plank door Samuel had hung across the cave's mouth, the neat stovepipe rising from stone, the chickens settling for the night in their boxes. "Never would have believed it," she said, shaking her head. "A home in a hillside, and the best eggs in the valley besides." Lydia only smiled and handed her the dozen she'd come for, thinking how strange it was that the very people who had turned them away now made the long trip out gladly, glad to be remembered kindly when they arrived. When the wagon had gone and the last light lay gold across the yard, Samuel came and stood beside her at the threshold, his arm settling easy around her shoulders, the way it had 100 evenings before. The hens murmured behind their wire, the spring whispered somewhere back in the dark, and the little room behind them glowed warm with lamplight and the smell of bread. "We built this," he said quietly, "out of nothing at all." "No," she answered, leaning into him, "out of each other." And together they watched the sun go down over the valley they had made their own.